the voice of the fans, the local interests, was effectively pushed out of the boardroom, and therefore the small-time fan did not have a say in how his club was ran. Hello one, hello all, hello short and hello tall, and welcome back to the Hispanophiles podcast, Travel in Spain with Only Half a Brain, proud sponsor of the 2026 Balconing World Championships. On today's episode of GolGolGolGol, the series that explores Spanish culture through its amazing football fandom, we are turning our attention nationwide and looking at things from a slightly different perspective. On episode 1 of GolGolGolGol, we looked at the meteoric rise of Villarreal from regional minnow to champions of Europe. On episode 2 of GolGolGolGol, we had turned our attention northwards to the most storied and folkloric club in Spanish club football, that is, of course, Athletic Club de Bilbao, and we asked ourselves the question, how true are its claims of 100% Basqueness? On episode 3 of GolGolGolGol, we are turning our attention to the whole industry of football here in Spain and understanding Spain's headache regarding corporate ownership. This episode is all about how Spanish football in the 1990s turned into a strictly corporate affair as a consequence of new legislation in the industry. But now, with new legislation pushed through in the past couple of years, we see an evolution in the Spanish sporting landscape, which is particularly pertinent to football, and with a new era of fan-owned clubs. We're going to be understanding what's going on first and foremost. However, as always, we're going to be jumping into our regular segments, starting with the Spanish news story of the week. As I sit here recording this one did happen a couple weeks ago. Nevertheless, as this is a sports episode, it feels right to talk about Marc Marquez and his incredible rebirth, his rise to the top once again to become a 7-time MotoGP world champion, only at the age of 32. I am 34, so a little bit of me dies inside hearing that, but it is what it is. I think we can all, most of us have by now left behind our childhood dreams of becoming a sports legend. The fact that Marc Marquez has become world champion once again, in and of itself, is not particularly big news. However, this becomes something notable as a consequence of a major accident he suffered while racing at Jerez de la Frontera, a city we will return to later in the episode, in 2020. And the recovery was very, very difficult for him. He had 4 separate periods of surgery, I think, and a severe infection on the road to recovery. He tried to get back on the bike, I think, on several occasions, 2021, 2022, although against the advice from the medical team that were supporting him. He was so driven, he wanted to get back on the bike and continue racing. Another crash before he was completely healed in Indonesia in 2022 triggered an episode of double vision, and that once again mandated him to stay off the bike and recover upon doctor's orders. In 2023, in October that year, Honda Repsol, one of the bigger names in MotoGP racing, they terminated his contract. This was the team with which he won 6 previous MotoGP world titles. It was one of the biggest pairings in sports history. And in 2024, he signed for a small-time privateer team, Gresini, a privately owned motorcycle racing team. Now, Gresini, they're no novices. They know the game. They've been in the sport decades and decades. This is a serious outfit. But because it is a privateer team and not a works team, they don't have the budget, they don't have the resources, they don't have quite the same gravity, and therefore he signed for a team knowing that he probably would not be driving a bike capable of challenging for the world title that year. Nevertheless, in 2024, 4 years after his first major accident which triggered the long and difficult period of recovery, Marc Marquez won 2 races in the season. And then such was his unexpected success in Gresini that the Ducati Works team signed him for 2025. So this was the first team after his accident that he had signed for that was capable of delivering a title fight. And after a stellar season all across 2025, winning countless races, he won his first title in his full season back with a competitive team. A remarkable amount of grit, determination and fight in the boy. And something that deserves to be shared, I think. So, Marc Marquez, congratulations to you. An amazing story and something I think we can all find inspiration in. We move on now to our other regular feature, which is Spanish Vocabulary of the Week. círculo virtuoso and un círculo vicioso, a virtuous cycle and a vicious cycle. Let's take a look at the definition of both of those. A vicious cycle, a sequence of reciprocal cause and effect in which two or more elements intensify and aggravate each other, leading inexorably to a worsening of the situation. And a virtuous cycle is defined as a chain of events in which one desirable occurrence leads to another, which further promotes the first occurrence, and so on, resulting in the continuous process of improvement. So, for example, you get a good job, you get a raise, you buy a nice suit, and then you go to a new job interview, and that helps you get even more money, which allows you to buy a better suit, blah, 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 blah. A pretty 2D understanding of it, and not the best example, but that makes sense in context. So we move on to the main talking point of the episode. Spain's fan ownership problem, how 30 years of private ownership and dodgy investors destabilized Spanish club football, and why new legislation designed to protect employees in Spanish sports industries may be an unlikely antidote. As usual with these episodes, I conduct a good amount of research to try and get my facts straight and my story legit. A few books that proved instrumental in the preparation for this episode are Miguel Lorenzo Pereira's Pasión, A Journey to the Soul of Spanish Football, published by Pitch Publishing; David Goldblatt's The Ball is Round, A Global Football History, published by Penguin; Rab McWilliams' Life in La Liga, The Story of Spanish Club Football, published by Arena Sport; and Giles Tremlett's España, A Brief History of Spain, published by Head of Zeus. Another indispensable source for information in preparation of this episode was the blog La Futbolteca, a blog dedicated to Spanish club football, an incredible mine of knowledge, not just about the higher echelons of Spanish football, but also about lower leagues as well. So La Futbolteca, if you're looking for some good reads about Spanish club football and the lower leagues in Spanish, go take a look. A story about the evolution of Spanish club football and the way in which it is run, administered, and managed. The obvious place to begin is with a brief history of club football in Spain. The first ever recorded match on Spanish soil was in 1870. Clue number 1, it was in Andalusia. Clue number 2, this city is synonymous with horses. And clue number 3, it is famous for wine. Can you guess which one it is? Correct, Jerez de la Frontera, the same place where Marquez suffered his terrible crash in 2022. Jerez de la Frontera, one of my favourite cities in the entire country, and one of the ones that we shall return to later on. Members of the Jerez Cricket Club in 1870 decided to have a kickabout amongst themselves, and that was the first ever recording we have of football deliberately played on Spanish soil. In Andalusia we stay, briefly. Copper deposits in Huelva province, slightly west from Jerez de la Frontera, were sold to British mining concerns in the 1860s, and the Rio Tinto Mining Company, named after the river that runs through Huelva, bought labour, technology and expertise from the British Isles. These are the people that built Spain's first ever railway on the continent. And of course, it was these Brits who institutionalised football in the Iberian Peninsula. The first ever team, anybody who's a big fan of football culture on the continent should know, Recreativo de Huelva, the oldest football club in Spain, founded 1889, known commonly as El Decano in Spanish football club circles, meaning the dean, purely as a nod of reverence to the age and superior standing of Recreativo in the eyes of many. The first football game they ever played was not in Huelva, it was in Sevilla, up the road, the administrative capital of Andalusia, in 1890, and that game was played against employees of a British-owned waterworks company in Seville. And that day was the glorious dawn of Spanish competitive football. This is according to David Goldblatt in The Ball is Round, A Global Football History. Unfortunately, the score of that game was not mentioned in the book. From there, over the next 10 years, we see football spreading across Spain, but not evenly. The places that were most exposed to foreign British merchants, these were the areas where football really spread. So Huelva, Sevilla, Cádiz and Jerez, quite clearly. Barcelona and Badalona, due to the degree of industrialisation in the far east of the country. Vigo, in the top northwest, and the other one being Biscaya province and the industrial cities along the Nervión River, most notably Bilbao. These places pioneered football in Spain and remain some of the areas where it is played most competitively to this day. Over the next 20 years, generally speaking, football spread to the inland regions, Toledo, Córdoba, Zaragoza, step by step. The first governing body of Spanish football appeared in 1909. This was the Federación Española de Clubes de Fútbol, the FECF, as it was known, on the 14th of October 1909 in Madrid. But for a long time, there was little harmony in the way in which the governing bodies of football in Spain ran their affairs. It was not the only body at the time, and not all big clubs signed up to be managed as part of this federation. Thus, it was not seen as completely legitimate, and the rival federation, the Unión Española de Clubes de Fútbol, came up at the same time with different clubs federating themselves with different organisations. But the federation we know to this day, the Real Federación Española de Fútbol, the RFEF, was founded and given royal backing in 1913, and it was federated to FIFA that same year. Again, with this royal backing and acknowledgement by FIFA, the other two entities died out very quickly, and the clubs affiliated to them became part of the RFEF. We now skip to 1920, an important year for Spanish football. Can anybody tell me why? Correct, that was the first time in which a Spanish team ever competed in the Olympic Games. That year, 1920, in the Belgian city of Antwerp. Spain sent a football team, 21 players, and the composition of this team tells a lot about where footballing prowess was at this time in Spanish history. Of the 21 players sent to the Olympic Games, 14 were Basque, 4 were from Barcelona, and 3 were from Galicia. Spain won a silver medal in a very messy tournament. By 1925, Spain first recognised professionalism in the sport. That is to say, the idea of somebody accepting a salary and income to play for a particular team, obviously to try and harness loyalty of the players they thought they were most effective. Fast forward to 1929, and professionalism in Spanish football takes another step further with the foundation of La Liga, 1929. First ever winners, of course, it was FC Barcelona. Until then, the primary contest in Spain had been the Copa del Rey. In this era, there were many different regional leagues that were very popular in Andalusia, on the East Coast, inside Madrid, in the Basque region, in Galicia. But in 1902, there was a proposition to have a cup to celebrate the coronation of Alfonso XIII, called the Copa de la Coronación. Of course, the year after the coronation had finished, so they simply renamed it Copa del Rey and continued with a national cup competition. The name had changed to the Copa del Presidente de la República in the 1930s, obviously as a consequence of the transition from dictatorship to the Second Republic. Going back to La Liga, there were only 10 competing sides in the first ever edition of La Liga. Can you name who they are? Pause now and have a little think. I'll put some lift music on now. If you said Athletic Club de Bilbao, Arenas Club, FC Barcelona, Real Madrid, Real Sociedad, Real Unión, Athletic de Madrid, Español, CE Europa, and Racing de Santander, you are absolutely correct. Award yourself 10 glass beads. Those were the founding clubs of La Liga. Many were regional champions, with Racing de Santander coming through what we'd now call a playoff system to get the final spot in the top 10. The proposition to create La Liga, the National League, came in 1927 and it kicked off in 1929. But around the corner were the 1930s, an era of great political turmoil in Spain, as best you probably already know. We had Primo de Rivera's dictatorship. Immediately after came the Second Republic. Then the country dissolved into chaos during the Spanish Civil War, ranging from 1936 to 1939. The Spanish Civil War obliterated the Spanish football landscape, most notably in Madrid, as sport became a lower priority compared to many other things. In place of a national league at this time, a lot of the regional leagues reappeared, particularly those that were behind Republican lines. They saw this in Levante, Andalusia, Catalonia, Galicia. Furthermore, many clubs that were in Republican hands decided to do foreign tours during this period as a way to spread the word about the Republican cause in Spain, get more support for their cause, and also to try and secure funding for the players to stay in professional contracts. Most notable among these were FC Barcelona and Athletic Club Bilbao. The viciousness of the Spanish Civil War did not spare many people managing football in the era. One anecdote I'd like to share with you comes from the assassination of FC Barcelona president at the time, Josep Sunyol, a Catalan name if there ever was one. Previously, he was a parliamentary deputy for the Esquerra Republicana, a left-wing Catalan nationalism party. He drove to the capital in 1936, shortly after the outbreak of war. On the highway, his car was pulled over by a Falangist militia who recognised who he was, and they executed him roadside. They shot him. Of course, upon reaching the end of the Spanish Civil War in 1939, national football contests began once again. La Liga resumed, and the Copa del Rey resumed, albeit now known as the Copa del Generalissimo. Of course, because Spain at that time was no longer a monarchy, El Caudillo, Franco himself, resumed the position as head of state. Franco clearly understood the symbolic importance of football to the many people and to the many nationalities within Spain. So began a period of top-down tinkering from his regime. The Copa del Rey, like I said, was named Copa del Generalissimo. The Delegación Nacional de Deportes was created as an umbrella organisation to execute Falangist policies in organised sport nationwide. The person put in charge of the DND was a man who we met in the previous episode, our idiot's guide to Toledo, General José Moscardó, a Francoist military serviceman who defended the Alcázar of Toledo that we looked at in the previous episode. Also upon Franco's orders, because red was seen as communist, the national team colours changed from red to blue at this time. This, of course, did not last, and Spain to this day are proud wearers of red during international competitions. Club names were Hispanicised. Athletic became Atlético. Football, Football, the English spelling was respelt as football, Futbol. Many presidents, many boards were replaced with appointees from Madrid, effectively lackeys for the regime, that could be expected to cooperate and serve as informants to the regime. Probably the two most famous examples of really heavy-handed top-down management during this era are Athletic Club de Bilbao and FC Barcelona, in order to dilute their ability to serve as proxies for regional political interest. But this was not a happy time for Spain. The fact that Franco had been on the side of the Axis powers during the war meant he was shunned by the victors, the Allies, thereafter. The UK and France withdrew their ambassadors to Spain in 1946, and they declined to recognise the legitimacy of the Franco regime. The Marshall Plan of 1948 delivered financial aid to much of Western Europe and East Asia. Spain was never included. Furthermore, it was banned from the United Nations until 1955 as a consequence of its support for the Axis powers. And the 40s and the 50s are known in Spain as the era of hunger. In 1959, economic reforms came. This is the first time we see greater access to foreign direct investment, and this is the first time that tourists from Western European nations were given visa-free travel to Spain. Again, we discussed this in episode 3 of the Hispanophiles podcast. The direct consequence, service industries and construction boomed, which marked the beginning of an era of prosperous entrepreneurial classes in Spain. Years later, we get a number of private investors and business owners who are able to invest directly in Spanish football clubs. Come 1970, and Spanish had formal trade agreements with the European Economic Community. Again, stronger ties to the foreign labour markets meant a greater presence of foreign players in Spanish club football. In 1964, Spain hosted and won the European Championships, and we cannot overlook the fact that Real Madrid won 5 consecutive European Cups from 1956 to 1960, a feat that has not been achieved since. What else happened in the 1970s in Spain? Of course, El Caudillo, Franco himself, he died in 1975. What followed was a transition to democracy that, on retrospect, was remarkably successful, though at the time it was a very nervy period for many people in Spanish politics. Censorship was repealed, the Spaniards had easier access to foreign media, and there began a craze in copying foreign fashion and tastes. And it's in the early 1980s we first see the Spanish football fans imitating subcultures from foreign countries that we see. This is when we see the casual scene from Britain first explored on Spanish terraces, and also a deliberate attempt to replicate Italian ultra culture inside stadia. This was most acutely seen amongst fans of FC Barcelona and RCD Espanyol, so we have a particular concentration of this phenomenon in Barcelona itself. And the game that is seen as most influential in the evolution of fan culture in Spain is the 1982 Italy versus Brazil contest at Espanyol's Sarria Stadium. The late 70s and early 80s saw the final hurrah of Basque football. In 4 consecutive years, Real Sociedad and Athletic Club de Bilbao shared La Liga honours with an incredible Athletic Club double in 1984. Since then, no Basque club has won La Liga title, though they have had success in La Copa del Rey. And then we get to the late 80s and 90s, the rise of professionalism in the sport, and that leads us to the big date, the main talking point we want to discuss in this episode. Since 1978, in the post-Franco era, Spain has had 2 chambers of parliament called Les Corts, and in 1990 Les Corts passed the Ley 10 of 1990, the Deporte, to come into effect on the 30th of June 1992. This was the deadline for professional football clubs to be converted into privately owned, limited companies, that is in Spanish, sociedades anónimas. That means all professional clubs, i.e. those in La Liga and La Segunda, were supposed to be converted into private companies and could not be owned on a share basis. It did not apply to the third tier and below. Otherwise, grassroots football, of course, it would die out in a second. It would be difficult to impose such measures on the financial and ownership situation of these clubs when they're just literally a couple of neighbours creating a team for their kids to play on. The purpose of this legislation was to make the sports teams more competitive. In practical terms, what it means was that corporations and holding companies would have to purchase majority shares of clubs and thus enjoy a controlling stake away from the fans, the people of the physical community inside which the football club is built and maintained. In order to take a controlling stake in a club, a potential investor was obligated to demonstrate a large cash guarantee ahead of time. Why would this be necessary? In order to avoid letting unqualified, low-resource companies and individuals potentially jeopardising the sport by making promises that they then could not back. But the outcome in La Liga and La Segunda, the law of unintended consequences, means that the voice of the fans, the local interests, was effectively pushed out of the boardroom, and therefore the small-time fan did not have a say in how his club was ran. In this era, there were some high-profile individuals purchasing shares in clubs out of their own pocket, not going through holding companies and the like. 4 notable examples. We have Getafe. Back in 2002, the local mayor invited construction magnate Angel Torres to acquire the club when it was way back down in the third tier. He now owns 99.3% of Getafe, Girona. Yes, part of it is now owned by the City Group, i.e. the holding company behind Manchester City, but it is part owned by Marcelo Claure, who also was a co-founder of Inter Miami, who owns 35% of the club, and Pere Guardiola, the brother of his more famous namesake, owns 16% of Girona Football Club. Real Mallorca. The former US tennis pro Andy Kolberg is now the president and majority shareholder of the club. And we have Real Valladolid. The Brazilian international Ronaldo purchased a 51% stake in the club in 2018, but press reports in 2025 indicate that he is about to sell his stake in the club. Of all professional, high-profile Spanish football clubs of the era, there were 4 that were exempt to this private ownership mandate as a consequence of Ley 10 of 1990 del Deporte. Those are Real Madrid, FC Barcelona, Athletic Club de Bilbao, and Club Atlético Osasuna. So how do they work? They are still owned by socios, i.e. members of the clubs that pay a monthly fee in exchange for a share of the club and a voice in the way in which it is run. That voice is expressed in voting rights for the club president and board of directors. These are the people then, after being elected, are the ones that do the day-to-day management of activities of the clubs in question. According to a very good New York Times article that I found about this topic recently, the number of associates of each of these clubs, FC Barcelona has 133,164, Real Madrid has 95,612, Athletic Club de Bilbao have 43,649, and Osasuna have 20,000 voting socios. So how does this work on a financial basis? Let's do some quick mathematics. FC Barcelona with 133,164 socios. That brings in the club €215 per adult per year and €107 per child. If we assume about 80% of those paying are adults and 20% are children, that gives FC Barcelona somewhere in the region of 25 to 30 million euros before including broadcasting, sponsorship, merchandise sales. That begs the question, if the purpose of the change of legislation was to improve competitiveness of sports teams, why were these 4 clubs exceptions to the rule? Now, the law said that the bookkeeping of these clubs for the 5 years prior, i.e. from the 86 to 92 season, if they could show no red years, no financial losses in a given year, that would make them exempt from the change to become privately owned clubs. They were also apparently given a special status as pillars of special cultural and nationalistic significance for ethnic groups for whom they primarily drew their support, as described by Rab McWilliam in Life in La Liga, one of the books we discussed at the beginning. Does this second point stack up? Each of the clubs, yes, you could argue, are a rather big cultural pillar in respected catchment area. We've got 2 very important Basque clubs there, one being from Biscaya, one being from Navarra, which again is culturally Basque. And then we have, of course, Madrid and Barcelona, clubs that boast incredible wealth of fans and importance in the media. But then, could you not say the same about any club from Andalusia? From Valencia, perhaps? Why was Real Sociedad not included? I don't know. So the jury for me is out on the second point, the idea of these being special as a consequence of their cultural relevance, because I would say that applies to most Spanish football clubs. Let's look at that legislation itself. Ley 10 of 1990 del Deporte. The purpose was to force clubs to consolidate a financial position. They were to do this by attracting wealthy backers to invest in the sport. A clear assumption here was that more disposable wealth and less debt in the top 2 leagues would result in a better quality of play, which would make the sport more attractive, which in turn would encourage investment in the form of advertising and healthier businesses taking a part, and bigger profile businesses also investing in La Liga and Spanish club football, with an assumed trickle-down to benefit every single person involved. But the unforeseen outcome of this was, of course, asset speculation. With a limited amount of clubs that could compete in the top 2 leagues, there was an arms race for companies looking to invest in European football to outbid each other to buy shares in the clubs that were competing. This, of course, created a bubble with regards to asset value, and the consequence was that clubs so eager to stay in the Liga would overspend on players deliberately to try and ensure their survival. Doing so, of course, meant running up huge debts, particularly if your club suffered relegation during the era before you could recuperate a lot of that investment. Classic cases where this has happened: Malaga CF, Deportivo La Coruña, a recent winner of La Liga, Real Racing Club Santander, one of the first ever La Liga participants, and Real Zaragoza, also a very big name that has played internationally. And has this law even worked? The Ley 10 of 1990 del Deporte, has it had the successes it was looking for? The league has become more polarised in the past 3 decades. In the last 21 seasons, only 3 clubs have lifted the silverware, and out of those 21, 2 were Atletico de Madrid. Prior to the year 2000, 10 years after the law was first introduced, those at the top have gotten wealthier, have consolidated position very, very well, and they've taken the silverware. What we have seen is the emergence of an oligarchy of clubs inside La Liga, inside Spanish football, whereby a small number of clubs consistently occupy the Champions League spots and the silverware. These, of course, are the achievements that give back, that pay out big prizes to those clubs who use that money to reinvest and keep winning the prize money. 2 decades after the Ley 10 of 1990 del Deporte was instituted, collectively, La Liga clubs accumulated debts of €500 million, and that comes from Miguel Lorenzo Pereira in Pasión, his book. In 2013, UEFA introduced the financial fair play initiatives. It is true that the running debts of Spanish clubs have declined since then. But this doesn't really solve the issue. Foreign backers still want in, they still engage in bidding wars for shares of clubs, and strong financial seasons that are followed by frivolous spending permitted by UEFA, they still leave staff, fans, and the wider community in a position where they cannot intervene, they cannot object, and they cannot have their say in how the club is run. There is no sign of this ending. So what do? We're going to look at 3 clubs that exist under the Accionariado Popular model, and we're going to analyse their case studies to see exactly how this works and how big can the ambition for these types of clubs be. In the past 15 years, we have seen the emergence of an alternative ownership model. That is the Clubes de Accionariado Popular, clubs of popular ownership. These are, by their own dictates, run exclusively by socios. The clubs themselves must always be majority owned by members, very similar to the German model, which is quite popular. The president is then chosen from among the voting socios. So the Clubes de Accionariado Popular are legally confined, as it stays, to the lower leagues. So we're talking La Segunda B, what is now La Primera Federación, and below. But they may be the future. Let's look at 3 case studies to understand how exactly the Clubes de Accionariado Popular work. We will start by going to the wine capital of Spain, that is Logroño, capital of La Rioja region, with 150,000 inhabitants, a city where the historic club was Club Deportivo Logroñés, founded officially on the 30th of May 1940. The stadium is Estadio Municipal Las Gaunas, with a capacity of 16,000, owned by the Logroño City Council, the Ayuntamiento. They had 9 seasons in the top flight in the history, and 8 of them came from 87 to 95, with 1 more in the 96 to 97 period. The highest ever finish in La Liga for CD Logroñés was 7th in the 89-90 season. For a relatively small town, this was a big achievement, but ambition got the better of the management of the club. Debts in the late 90s began to accumulate as expensive signings made in an attempt to keep the club in La Liga resulted in a huge increase in overheads. In 1999-2000 season, 2 immediate relegations put it in a perilous position. First, as a consequence of its low league finish, pushed it down from La Segunda to La Segunda B, and then failure to meet these payments to pay off its debts to its creditors forced a relegation in the same year to La Tercera, confusingly called because it was the 4th division of Spanish football, even being called the 3rd. A quick jump back up to the Segunda B 2 years later didn't help because they went back down to La Tercera in 2004, and another forced relegation in 2008 to lower leagues, with debts now around the €400,000 mark, more or less spelt the end for CD Logroñés. In 2009, La Federación Riojana de Fútbol, which was the regional federation for football, did not accept CD Logroñés' application for participation in the 6th regional league of Spanish football. Basically, they did not trust that the board of the club would ever be able to pay that money back, so they refused its application for a new competing license. Thus, on the 7th of August 2009, CD Logroñés ceased to exist as an entity. Now, of course, fans were in dismay at this decision, but they'd been expecting this or something similar for a long time. Throughout the saga in the past couple of years, a group of fans meeting at the Puerto Cero in Las Gaunas, the stadium, came together with a plan. They were happy to start from the bottom, from the Regional Preferente, and work up the leagues with a new entity, a new football club, to give the fan culture of Logroño presence once again in the higher leagues. So on the 4th of June 2009, just before the disappearance of CD Logroñés, a core group of fans founded Sociedad Deportiva Logroñés, SD Logroñés. The paperwork was done, but they had no big investor and no competitive license. Therefore, they decided to put this theory in action, and they became a Club de Accionariado Popular. In order to keep alive the sporting history, the legacy of the fan culture of CD Logroñés, they used the same colours, red and white stripes with black shorts, and they were immediately permitted to use Las Gaunas Stadium, even though they were in the 6th division. The president was Rafael Alvarez, and in their first season, they won 39 out of 40 games with a promotion straight to La Tercera in the group of 16, where they came second in their first season. In the 2010 and 11 season, a presidential change took place and Eduardo Guerra came in, and he was instrumental in bringing former SD Logroñés player Agustín Abadia, a local legend, into the dugout for the new manager of CD Logroñés that season. Under Abadia, they were victors in their second season of the league with a string of 24 unbeaten matches, accumulating 96 points in a single season. And the playoff game to La Segunda B from La Tercera against Peñasport FC, SD Logroñés won 4-0 at home, but lost 3-0 on the road to Peñasport, and thus were promoted by goal difference. That means in only their fourth season of existence, Sociedad Deportiva Logroñés managed to get to La Segunda B, the third tier of Spanish football, an amazing achievement. They finished 10th in their first season, but then the following season they got back to La Tercera, where they have now played for many seasons, although that now is called La Segunda Federación. The players of SD Logroñés are semi-professional, but a lot of work is done by the volunteers. The security, the ticket checks, the creating of merchandise, the sales, selling beers, selling alcohol, selling hot dogs at the games, whatever it might be, pitch maintenance. A lot of this is done by volunteers, which is beautiful to see. The second club we'll look at that operate under this model are the Unionistas de Salamanca, a city in Castilla y León, and it is the home of the oldest university in the entire country. The old club was Unión Deportiva Salamanca. It was originally called Unión Deportiva Española, but the Second Republic mandated a removal of the word Española because it was seen as too nationalist for their political taste, and the club became Club Deportivo Salamanca. But fans did not like that name, and they tried to get hold of the word Unión back once again in the team name. Thus, on the 15th of January 1932, a compromise was made whereby it was labelled Unión Deportiva de Salamanca. That is the name it held on for most of its life. Unión Deportiva Salamanca had previously played in La Liga. The highest ever finished was 7th in the 1970s, and they competed for 12 seasons in total in the highest tier of Spanish club football. They were back in La Liga in the 90s, but relegation to Segunda B in 2011 led to a drop in revenue, with bankruptcy and administration following. The city went into a state of panic. Local businessman Juan José Hidalgo made overtures to do whatever necessary to save the club from administration, but the investments, the money he had promised, never ever materialised. According to La Futbolteca, the club was running with €23 million debts, an eye-watering volume for such a small club. On the 18th of June 2013, administrators were called into a meeting with creditors, many of which were employees of the Banco Popular, but no senior representative from the bank actually showed up to the meeting. Thus, the courts had no faith in the ability for any of the board to once again find a financial plan to save the club. Thus, they put its assets up for auction, and in doing so, this indicated the end of the fiscal entity Unión Deportiva Salamanca. Now, the board, the directors, had realised which way the winds were blowing, and they'd acted very intelligently up until that point. And this, I think, shows genuine care in their local community and what they were doing. Prior to bankruptcy, prior to the 18th of June 2013, they had transferred ownership of the B team of Unión Deportiva and the youth teams, the female team. They'd offered them to different entities to protect them from bankruptcy. So basically just passing one asset from one to another, and therefore the debts stayed with the original club, but the younger players, the younger generation, were effectively freed from the risk, from the danger of the club going under. A very smart move. This worked in the short term. As Union went under, the courts approved, and these assets were initially offloaded to different entities, but FIFA, and by proxy the RFEF, did not approve of national courts interfering with football management under their jurisdiction. FIFA don't approve of anyone other than themselves taking decisions. Pressure from FIFA forced the Castilla y León Football Federation to not admit the B team to compete in a regional league in 2013, and they also lost their federation license. But once again, we see in the darkest hour, a group of fans took umbrage and they created the popularly owned football club Unionistas de Salamanca. Again, Unionistas being a direct nod to their preferred moniker throughout their existence. This entity was founded on the 26th of August 2013, deliberately using black and white playing colours, the same as Unión Deportiva Salamanca, with Javier Tejedor Rodriguez as president. Now, the Unionistas took a while watching things unfold with FIFA, with the RFEF, with the courts, and thus they were only federated with the Castilla y León Football Federation from the 2nd of September 2014. So they spent an entire year basically not officially competing. That first season, in 2014, after being federated, was in the Primera División Provincial de Salamanca, and they were promoted on their first attempt, which means for the 2015-16 season, they took part in the Primera Regional in Castilla y León, and they won the season, they won the league without a single loss. 27 victories, 7 draws, and were promoted to La Tercera, the black hole for football clubs, because it's so hard to get out of La Tercera. They were third in group in the first season, winning it outright in 2017-18, 3 points clear of the second place club, and in the playoff final, they beat Unión Deportiva Soguellamos to secure promotion to La Segunda B. Again, Unionistas de Salamanca, being a club de accionariado popular, are owned by their socios, and their socios do an amazing job. The marketing department engages with its fan base. They vote on kit designs, they vote on events, popular events around the club to generate money. The Unionistas have a cap on new members to ensure there is no overcrowding inside their stadium, and the highest profile socio of Unionistas de Salamanca is none other than Vicente del Bosque, the Salamanca-born manager of the 2010 Men's World Cup winning side. A huge name to have in your ranks. Unionistas also celebrates a supporters club day with Sociedad Deportiva Logroñés, who we've just talked about, more or less a friendly game in which both clubs come together in a celebration of the way in which they conduct their business and the way in which they run their football clubs. And I think it's not in any way controversial or hyperbolic to say Unionistas de Salamanca is the highest positioned fan-owned club in the country, in all of Spain. And for the third case study we're going to look at, we're going to go south and we're going to visit Jerez de la Frontera once again and talk about the incredible story of Jerez Deportivo Football Club, which is, as it happens, my football club here in Spain. As we already discussed, the first ever recorded football match on Spanish soil took place in Jerez de la Frontera on the 1st of November 1870. It is a city with a lot of legacy when it comes to organised football. The old club, the most historic club, Jerez Club Deportivo. It is the only club from Jerez de la Frontera to play in La Liga. Their colours are light blue with white accents, and their stadium was always the Estadio Municipal El Chapín, with a capacity of 20,523, located behind the train station. In the early decades of the 20th century, many sporting entities came and went in Jerez de la Frontera. On the 24th of September 1947, after the closure of Jerez Football Club, the year before, Jerez Club Deportivo was founded. They changed the spelling from Jerez with a J to Jerez with an X on the 21st of August 1963. For most of its history, Jerez Club Deportivo was floating between the second and third tiers of Spanish club football. The only La Liga appearance they ever managed was in the 2009 and 10 season. They finished last, with 8 victories and only 34 points. But again, the club spent enormously on transfers to try and stay in La Liga, and were already facing bankruptcy proceedings even before the season had closed. Relegation, of course, compounded issues, and with 29 million euros in debt, the club continued with Joaquin Morales as president and majority shareholder, who continued to make a lot of loud noise about his plans to save the club from administration. But players were not receiving wages. Staff went unpaid. The 2012 and 13 season saw them bottom of La Segunda, going down to La Segunda B, still owing 2 million to the treasury, to the taxman basically, which is not something you can put off for long. Fans had had enough of Morales and enough of his lack of competency while managing the club. Thus, on the 28th of June 2013, a breakaway group from El Colectivo Sur, which is the ultra group of Jerez de la Frontera, founded Jerez Deportivo Football Club. El Colectivo Sur, the ultra group, founded in 1991 and thus are often referred to in their materials as KS91. They are ideologically aligned with left-wing policies. Make of that what you will. I'm not here to convince you of any political idea. But this means they have a friendship with Los Bidis of Sevilla and the Riazorblus of Deportivo La Coruña. The anticipated dissolution of Jerez Club Deportivo, which was to go into admin, sparked the decision to try and create an entity that would replace it and therefore give some continuity to the fan culture in Jerez de la Frontera. The Real Federación Española de Fútbol agreed to allow Jerez Deportivo to use the vacated spot left by Jerez Club Deportivo. But 5 days after putting pen to paper, 5 days later, Morales shared news of a new investor who had cleared debts of Jerez Club Deportivo and who had saved it from administration. This meant that Jerez Club Deportivo could keep their spot, which means that Jerez Deportivo Football Club could no longer now come in at the same level of football. Now, it's not as if he didn't know this was coming. He was aware of the protest group, the breakaway group, doing their thing to spite what he was going to do. He waited until the fans put that investment, their time, their energy, their money into making this brand new company, this brand new organisation, and then, to spite them, he announced that the old club was going to be saved. This started what has become a civil war on the terraces of Jerez de la Frontera. This new club, Jerez Deportivo Football Club, and the fans, the breakaway fans, decided to proceed from the bottom of Spanish football, the 8th tier in Andalusia. 4 promotions in 5 years got them back to La Tercera, and in the 2018-19 season, in Group 10 of La Tercera, Jerez Deportivo Football Club, the fan-owned club, finished above Jerez Club Deportivo, the privately owned club, for the first time ever. Fast forward to March 8th, 2020, when COVID was knocking on the door of Spain and there were confirmed cases sprouting up Andalusia. The last played game of the season before everything was shut down was Jerez Deportivo Football Club at home in El Chapin to Jerez Club Deportivo, and Jerez Deportivo won 2-0. I am going to be writing a book about that story. So these are 3 clubes de accionariado popular in Spain with incredible stories of sacrifice, of determination, of choosing community over money. I absolutely love these. But they tell the story of how you don't need a big budget and a big checkbook to have a club that works, that is in touch with its fan base, and that can achieve things. This is why I think it's important. But there is something new coming on the horizon. New legislative changes to sporting governance in Spain may mean that the Clubes de Accionariado Popular are able to achieve even more than they originally thought possible. So, on the 31st of December 2022, the Boletín Oficial del Estado published the Ley del Deporte en España de 2022, aka 39 of 2022. It is an enormous document that came into effect a day later on January the 1st, 2023. What this law does, it is an attempt to pursue significant and wide-sweeping reforms in the practice and management of organised sport in Spain. Essentially, it offers greater protection services to professionals within sports as well as employees and staff of any sports organisation. It also expands the concept of professionalism in sports. It contains many predictable things, words about trying to fight discrimination on the basis of sex, race, physical condition, but one particular clause relating to ownership of sports clubs is what's relevant to this discussion in this podcast episode. That is, the difference between status of football players and club employees between different tiers, i.e. between La Segunda and now La Primera Federación, the 3rd division, this has been minimised. So with regards to professional standing, now there is a lot more in common between football players in Spain at different levels of the sport. And from what I can tell, there is now no legal mandate for clubs above the semi-professional level there to be sociedades anónimas, to be private companies. Again, the reason for that is promotion from La Primera Federación to La Segunda should not have any immediate clear effect on your relationship to your employer as an employee. Therefore, excluding a club potentially that has won promotion, won the right to compete in a higher league, should not affect your ability to continue working inside the sports industry in Spain. That is my understanding. In addition, presidential candidates for clubs now no need to show a 15% budget guarantee. This gives a wider scope of potential candidates, and one could argue that is probably a better thing because it gives less favour to the incumbent. Now, it's worth saying, and this is the final point, the status quo is not really affected with regards to fan-owned clubs competing in the higher divisions of Spanish football. As it stands, in the top two tiers, the only clubs that are publicly owned by fans remain Osasuna, Barcelona, Athletic Club Bilbao, and Real Madrid. But with this change in legislation, as clubs like Jerez Deportivo, Unionistas de Salamanca, and Este Logroñés continue to rise up the leagues as a consequence of their great work. That's where I'm going to leave this episode, guys. Thank you so much to listen. I would love to know in comments what you guys think of fan-owned football in Spain. What realistically are the highest things you think these clubs can achieve? Or what do you really think about the state of professionalism and private ownership in sport in the country? The last feature, as always, is going to be a Spanish recommendation of the month, and this time it is our girl Rosalía. Now, I hold my hands up, I'm not the biggest fan of pop music, but what I like about Rosalía is what I like about Ed Sheeran. They are classically trained, great songwriters, very naturally talented, but in their music, in their back catalogue, there is a lot of variety. They don't stick to one sound, one core lyrical message. There is a lot going on. And of everything inside Rosalía's back catalogue, my favourite song would have to be Alta Cultura. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but that's my recommendation for the week. Thank you guys so much for taking a listen to Hispanophiles podcast, Travel in Spain with Only Half a Brain, and I look forward to seeing you very soon. Goodbye.